Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar, The Role of Event Data Recorders in Accident Reconstruction. In passenger cars and light trucks, event data recorders, black boxes, are electronic devices that are capable of capturing information related to a crash. This technology has become increasingly recognized as another tool for use in reconstructing accidents. The stored data that is available from an EDR should be treated as evidence, indicating that preservation and spoliation issues apply. During this program, the presenter will cover the following: the current status of event data recorder technology in passenger cars and light trucks, acronyms and terminology, the various types of crash data available from an event data recorder, how event data recorder data is accessed and preserved, how event data recorder data can be used in accident reconstruction, and federal regulations concerning event data recorders. The presenter for today's program is George Meinschein. Mr. Meinschein is a professional engineer who specializes in the field of mechanical engineering. He's a former automotive repair shop owner-operator who maintains current certifications as an ASE Master Automotive and Medium and Heavy Truck Technician. Since 1999, Mr. Meinschein has owned a forensic engineering company and has provided expert services and testimony in areas concerning machine design, product defects, mechanical engineering, repair shop practices, vehicle examinations, accident reconstruction, and vehicle and equipment fires. We will take 2 question and answer breaks during today's presentation. If you have a question, please use the chat or Q&A feature found on the right-hand side of the screen to submit your questions. We encourage all attendees to submit questions throughout the presentation. Tomorrow morning, I will send out an email with a link to the archived recording of this webinar, and we do ask that you take time to fill out the survey that will appear on your screen after the webinar is over. I now invite you to sit back, relax, and enjoy. I'm going to turn the program over to our distinguished presenter, Mr. George Meinschein. George, the program is all yours.
All right. Thank you, Matt. I'd like to thank everybody for attending this presentation. It's my first time with this WebEx platform, so I'm hoping everything goes as smoothly as our practice session did. Unfortunately, I can't hear any audio from the participants. I'd love to hear everybody's accents from where they're coming from. I'm told I have a Jersey accent, but I don't hardly believe that for a minute. So having said that, let me get rolling here. At first, I thought I could never stretch this presentation to last for a whole hour or anywhere near that. And then as I got into it, I said, oh my God, I can't fit everything I need to say anywhere even close to within 1 hour. So let me get going with that, and we'll do a little discussion, or I'll do some discussion on EDRs, or event data recorders, and where they fall in the accident reconstruction picture today. We'll start off with what is an event data recorder? And per the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, an event data recorder is a function or a device installed in a motor vehicle to record technical vehicle and occupant information for a brief period of time, and that would be seconds, not minutes, is what they consider a brief period of time, before, during, and after a crash for the purpose of monitoring and assessing vehicle safety system performance. For instance, EDRs may record pre-crash vehicle dynamics and system status. Pre-crash vehicle dynamics is simply what this vehicle was doing before it got involved in an impact or an accident. How fast was it going? Was it going left, right? Was it rolling over? Were the brakes on? Was the throttle on? All those things that lead us into what was going on up to the point of impact, and might give us some clues as to how the accident occurred. System status could be anything from were the seatbelts buckled or unbuckled? Was the ABS system active or inactive? Was traction control active? Was cruise control on? Those types of things are more system status types of indicators. Next is driver inputs. Again, we get back to the later model vehicles. Some of the data they put out includes steering angle, which would be the driver's input to the steering wheel, so you can tell what direction he was trying to move the car in before the impact. Certainly what he was doing with the gas pedal, the brake pedal. Some of them will give you indications of whether the seat was forward or rearward, or seat placement, those types of things, what gears the transmission was in. And again, depending on how new the vehicle is, the data gets better and better and better as vehicles get newer and newer. Let's see, vehicle crash signature. Now that is once we actually have an impact, we want to look at that and see how significant of an impact is it. Did we just whack into a speed limit sign? Did we run into the side of a house? Did we hit a concrete bridge abutment? All these things give us different vehicle crash signatures or vehicle crash pulses, and those are a measure of the severity of the accident, and it all comes into play with telling the airbag system whether or not to start deploying whatever devices it has at its disposal to deploy. Next is restraint usage and deployment status. Again, restraint usage would be, are my seat belts buckled or not buckled? Deployment status, that is an indication of the airbag module said, hey, let's fire the driver's airbags in the steering wheel. Let's fire the driver's side, side impact airbag out of the door panel or out of the side of the seat. Same thing for the passenger goes, and then nowadays we have headrail airbags. We have, 7 or 8 or 9 airbags in some vehicles for sure. Next thing is post-crash data, such as the activation of an automatic collision notification system. Typical of that would be OnStar. And typically post-crash data, that only lasts for a very, very, very short, relatively short time in milliseconds after the crash itself. All right, so what vehicles have EDR? I mean, obviously not all vehicles have them, so some passenger cars and even brand new cars today, there are still some made that we're told they do not have an EDR. I find it hard to believe. I think Mercedes-Benz still claims they do not have an EDR in their vehicles. And they're sticking to that story. Every engineer I meet from Mercedes-Benz, I ask them the same question, and they've been saying no, 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 no. Most others that I can think of, they seem to have them depending on the model of the vehicle, certainly model and year. And again, the newer the vehicle, the better the odds are it will have an EDR in it. Some light trucks, same thing goes for the light trucks. If it's got an airbag system, there's the potential it will have an EDR built into it. Medium-duty trucks are somewhere between pickup trucks and heavy-duty trucks, which are the next category. And I'll get into a little bit the differences between passenger cars, light trucks, and medium trucks as a group versus heavy-duty trucks for those vehicles that have EDRs on board. All right, how can I find out if the subject vehicle, or the one that you're actually interested in finding out about, has an EDR? In heavy trucks, the EDR is typically part of the ECM. And in a couple slides, we'll get into what the heck each of the abbreviations stand for. I'll do a little bit of terminology so you won't be completely lost when confronted with this stuff again. But in heavy trucks, the event data recorder is typically part of the engine control module. And I don't know if it started out that way. It turns out that it is an event data recorder, but for crash applications or accident reconstruction, I think it was more of an afterthought, or somebody finally realized, like, hey, we can use this stuff for accident reconstruction. And with heavy trucks, it's not so much a crash pulse as it is what was this truck doing. Literally, sometimes you can get data, for a full minute before the crash happened as to how fast they were going, whether they were stepping on the brakes, whether the clutch was in or out. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff you can get from heavy trucks. Heavy trucks, the event data recorder capabilities are dependent upon which engine or what engine is installed in that particular truck. You can get a Freightliner truck, for instance, with either a Caterpillar or a Cummins or a Detroit diesel engine, and depending on which engine is in that particular truck, that'll tell you how much data is available. Like Caterpillar has their own setup going for EDR capabilities. Cummins has their own setup. International has their own setup. And so far, they're all different. Most of them are geared toward engine performance and fleet performance. It's not done with accident reconstruction in mind. So, keeping that in mind, we're lucky we do get any data, I think, from heavy trucks. And typically, heavy trucks, the data that you will get is in conjunction with the last time the truck came to a stop, or if somebody stops suddenly. And the level of that suddenness can be programmed into the ECM to decide was that or wasn't it a sudden enough stop to bother recording anything. But again, this is not typically crash related. It has to do with more so engine performance and fleet maintenance than anything else, I think. But it has crash investigation applications as well. The best source I've found to keep up with the heavy truck stuff, I'll give you a minute to copy that link down. It's www.heavytruckedr.org. That's what I've found has the best information online for what you might be able to get from any given truck/engine combination. Plug in the year, which I guess software system the ECM is using for that particular year, and it'll tell you typically what kind of data. If you search on that website enough, you'll find, I think, example reports and a lot of good information how to help narrow down the heavy truck things. All right, let's see. Continuing on this, for the light trucks, passenger cars, and pickup trucks, typically year, make, model, and on occasion the engine, and that's usually if it's a gasoline or a diesel engine. No further distinction necessary on that, are necessary to find out if that particular vehicle has an EDR on board. Right now in North America, the software and hardware to access stored data, if it's going to be available commercially, it's going to be available through Bosch Diagnostics. I think they're the only ones still that make this type of equipment available. In some cases, only the vehicle manufacturer has the ability to access stored data. On those vehicles that have EDRs, for manufacturers that have not signed on with Bosch to do their the technical end of the crash data retrieval stuff, only the vehicle manufacturers still have the software and data. Even the ones that have license to Bosch, recently Toyota came on board, and it's like a backwards, integration of the systems. They'll start with the newer vehicles first, and they'll work backwards. Even though Toyota had EDR capabilities back to maybe 2003 or 2006 or somewhere along there in some of their vehicles, we don't have access commercially to every vehicle that Toyota has made with an EDR, even though Toyota does, for example. The good news is the industry, I think, is trending towards making the data more accessible. Part of that is the upcoming federal regulations that I will talk about in a little bit, but they're starting to, I guess, push manufacturers into, if you're going to have an EDR in your vehicle, it's going to have to comply with certain things that the U.S. federal government has set up. All right, so now to break away, because I really intended this seminar to be more about what we can do with passenger cars and light trucks and a handful of medium trucks than heavy trucks, because I could probably spend a day on each of them, but from this point on, I'm going to pretty much ignore the heavy truck stuff and concentrate on the lighter vehicles. So we're going to start with what is CDR as opposed to EDR. And CDR stands for Crash Data Retrieval. This has been around since the late 90s, I think, is when Bosch, well, actually it was Vitronics early on, but they started to get into this technology, and they're still currently the only ones in North America that make it available. It's called the Bosch Diagnostics CDR system. was formerly Vitronics, and then Bosch bought them up, is my understanding, or somehow they took control of Vitronics and started making their equipment part of the Bosch Diagnostics family. Bosch makes the software and the hardware available commercially to accident investigators or insurance adjusters or law enforcement, anybody that wants to buy it, basically. It's a program that you would load onto your computer or laptop that allows you to use a USB port connected to their hardware and then in turn connected to the vehicle in one manner or another to access the data. Just recently, Bosch has now included a free CDR file reader on their website. You can download it from their website, and basically it's the CDR program. It's their entire software, but it's not activated so that you can go do downloads or imaging of modules yourself. The only thing it allows you to do is if somebody gives you a .cdr file, in that format, which is the original format that the program produces, it'll allow you to open that file and view it just as if you had the full-blown program. So I'll give you a second to copy down that link because that will always have the latest version of the software available. Even if you've got a file that somebody pulled off of a vehicle or out of a vehicle 6 years ago, you should always open it with the latest version of the program to make sure it's got the latest translation and any chance of error is reduced because from time to time they do find little glitches in the program. So www.boschdiagnostics.com/software/CDR_software.aspx will get you to the page where you can download your own latest version of the CDR file reader. And also on the Bosch website, they have the latest corresponding list of vehicles that their equipment covers. And I didn't give you a link directly to the latest list, which corresponds to version 4.1, I think it is, of the software, because I was afraid when they come out with version 4.2, the link to version 4.1 probably wouldn't work anymore. So at least this will get you to the page where you can choose to download the, the corresponding version of the latest available list. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit briefly about terminology that you might expect to see in this field. I'll start off with some routine things for some relatively routine parts and what people call them. We have the ACM, which stands for Airbag Control Module, and as you might guess, that is sort of kind of the brains of the system. It watches various inputs and it controls various outputs. This is the component that makes the decision to fire the airbags or the seatbelt pretensioners once it determines that the impact event is going to be severe enough to warrant that. Next one is a DERM. It's D-E-R-M, and essentially it's the same exact thing as an airbag control module, but they call it a diagnostic and energy reserve module. And again, it's different name basically for the same exact thing. ECM is an engine control module as opposed to an airbag control module. This is the module that's in charge of your fuel injection, spark advance. On occasion, its transmission shifting is monitored through this or controlled through this. For the most part, it's what operates your engine in like every car on the road. Well, at least made today. There's still some on the road that don't have ECMs, but for the most part, anything with fuel injection, electronic fuel injection, it's got an ECM in there controlling things. Next, we have a PCM, which is a powertrain control module. This is basically the same thing as an engine control module. The powertrain control modules in Ford is where they store some of the data that is related to a crash, and the PCM in a Ford is one thing that the Bosch CDR program allows us to access, the data stored from a crash that's been dropped off there. Next is RCM, that's Restraint Control Module. That is Ford's terminology for an ACM. They decided we're not going to call it an ACM like everybody else. We're going to call it an RCM. So again, same thing, same functions, different name. ROS stands, if you see that in the abbreviation anywhere in the literature, that stands for rollover sensor. You know, as the industry and technology progressed, we went from airbags that were only good for frontal impacts to side impact airbags. Then we went to head rail for rollover airbags. It's been a transition from one to the other, and as they did that, they now incorporate rollover sensors in the vehicles. SDM, again, another name for an ACM or a DERM. Essentially it's the same thing. It's a sensing and diagnostic module. This is the module that's in charge of monitoring airbag system components and deciding if and when to fire the airbags. Now, this is not a piece of hardware. This is something in the software for the most part. Algorithm enable is a point in time that the airbag module wakes up. It has seen or recognized that there's an impact, so this is the very leading edge of the impact. It's enough of a bump to wake up the module, and the module is now watching very closely because it's getting ready to make a decision. Is this going to be a no big deal, or is this going to be something that we want to deploy something in to help our occupants? So algorithm enable, for all practical purposes, it's equal to time equals 0 for the impact event. Next is DLC, that's data link connector. That is a plug underneath the dashboard, typically. I mean, it could be somewhere in the console, but it's generally not too far away from the vehicle driver, where technicians at the repair shop or dealer, they would plug in their diagnostic equipment to decide if you have a trouble code related to the performance of your vehicle, or ABS or anything. Pretty much everything is accessed through that DLC or data link connector for you to communicate with the network in your car, and that's the same connector that the Bosch CDR system, if everything is working well enough after a crash, and you're lucky enough to have that still have its integrity up to par, you can access the crash data through that connector underneath the dashboard. RDS, I believe it's peculiar to Fords. It's a restraint deployment signal. Ford, because they store data in a couple places, we have the airbag control module, or the RCM in Ford's case. That might store some data, particular the crash pulse data or delta V information or acceleration information. That might be stored in the RCM. A lot of other data, which comes from the network of components on the vehicle, like what the gas pedal was doing, what the vehicle speed sensor says the car was doing, what gear was in, all those things, they're stored in the PCM. The PCM, that continues to write new data as long as the key is on until it gets the restraint deployment signal from the RCM. So hopefully, if the airbags went off in a Ford in a crash or a Ford product in a crash, that restraint deployment signal made it over to the PCM in time to preserve some of the data associated with the crash. And of course, from time to time that gets interrupted from the wiring getting wrecked, or the battery gets whacked in a crash and we lose power, so that signal never gets to the PCM in time. But we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a few minutes. Next is miles per hour. Hopefully that looks familiar to everyone attending this webinar. Kilometers per hour, that's essentially the same thing as miles per hour. It tells me vehicle speed, but it's in a metric version instead of the imperial version. RPM stands for engine speed. It's actually revolutions per minute, and that's typically used for engine speed, and it's displayed by a tachometer on the dashboard. Delta V is nothing more than a change in velocity, and velocity is the capital V. The delta V could be if you were traveling at 50 miles an hour before anything happened and at 30 miles an hour after the event. Then we have 50 minus 30, so that would be a 20 mile per hour change in velocity, or a delta V of 20 miles per hour. Now, of course, even if you're driving at 50 mile an hour and you pull up to a traffic light, you would have a 50 mile per hour delta V. That's not terribly exciting because it happens over many seconds. It's when you have a delta V in a very short period of time, like on the order of a tenth of a second or 0.2 of a second. That's what we're looking at in these cases. Degrees per second, that's a measure of rotational velocity, and that has to do with, again, how fast someone is turning a steering wheel or how fast the vehicle is changing direction as it turns about its vertical axis. Or it could be how fast a vehicle is rolling over if it rotates about its longitudinal axis, so the vehicle rolls from the left to the right, that type of a thing. And I think the last one is G. Could be a capital G. Sometimes it's a lowercase g. That is a unit of acceleration. You may have heard people refer to an astronaut feels 10 G's when the space shuttle takes off or whatever, something along those lines. Or if any of you have done cases involving accidents, you may have very well come across the G as a term of or unit of acceleration. 1 G is approximately equal to 32.2 feet per second squared. And I didn't put it in here, but that's also approximately equal to 9.81 meters per second squared. Okay. Accessing data with the CDR system. Once you have the CDR system, how do you actually get this thing to tell you what you want to know? And again, the first and what's considered the best way to do this is through the data link connector, which is underneath the dashboard typically. You connect your laptop to the Bosch. It's actually a box filled with digital components and connectors, so it's wired in between your laptop and the vehicle. And some vehicles you have to turn the key on. Some vehicles you don't even have to turn the key on. As soon as you power it up, it'll start to and hit the go button on the software. Essentially, it'll start to pull data from the vehicle. The next method, if the car is so badly mangled, or if it's one where you need the keys and don't have the keys, or the wiring is torn out of the vehicle, or anything else, pretty much goes wrong with the vehicle, you can access the module directly. And many times the modules are under one of the front seats. They're inside the bottom of the console. They're buried in the dashboard near the floor somewhere. But usually in a matter of 10 to 15 minutes tops, you can actually get to the module and plug straight into the module and bypass all the rest of the wiring in the vehicle or damaged vehicle. The only drawback to this, or I shouldn't say the only, but one of the drawbacks to this, once you disconnect the module so that you can access it directly, you run the chance of introducing erroneous data because the module is no longer seeing the rest of the components that were plugged into it. It can't tell you if the seat belts are buckled or unbuckled at that point because it's been disconnected from the system, so to speak. So that's not as good as the first straight to the DLC method. Next one, it's direct to module, but now we're going to do it in the lab or on the bench, out of the vehicle. You've taken the module out of the vehicle, and essentially it's the same cable, same everything else, but in a more controlled environment. And again, this is the least preferred method because once you power that module up, if you drop it off the bench or if you bump it good enough, you run the risk of introducing a whole new event because many times the accelerometers that tell the module something's going on are internal to the module, so it's entirely possible for you to introduce an entirely new event that you really didn't want to have there. Which brings me to the issues of spoliation. Non-deployment events. Now that's an event where the module woke up. There was enough of a bump or an impact to wake the module up, but then the module says, you know what, this is not going to be so bad. I'm not going to fire airbags. I'm not going to fire any seatbelt retentioners. So it's a non-deployment event. That is not stored in memory that lasts forever. It can be written over by essentially another non-deployment event, or it can be written over by a deployment event, depending on the module. So you have to be careful with how you treat the modules to make sure that you don't introduce any new data or overwrite any data that was there that can be important. Ford PCMs are peculiar in that they depend on that receiving that restraint deployment signal to cut off what data they're writing into memory, and hopefully lock that down so you can associate that with the crash that you're investigating. But if that signal is lost or never got to the PCM, even if somebody turns the key off after the accident and you have a tow truck driver come up and turn the key back on, from that point on, you are overwriting the good data with data that is essentially meaningless to the crash. And the same thing happens whether it's a tow truck driver, insurance adjusters, salvage yards. I think a lot of Ford data is lost just because people don't know how to handle this type of equipment. And I know there are several cases out there where arguments have been made that the module wasn't preserved. Well, certainly it's easier to preserve the module than it is an entire vehicle, or nobody downloaded or imaged the module before the whole thing was scrapped. And some people in this, I guess as time goes on, there are cases where less and less roadway evidence is left. With today's cars with ABS brakes, they don't leave skid marks like they used to. So many times the data in the EDR, sometimes that's the only evidence or the best evidence of what actually happened in an accident. Okay, now here's a typical setup. Laptop on the front seat right next to the steering wheel there. A USB serial port adapter is plugged into a USB port on the side of the laptop. That's plugged into a gray cable that's looped around and plugged into that blue box, which is actually the Bosch, the CDR unit. And then from that, there's a black cable that circles around and loops up to the DLC that is, mounted to the underside of the dash. And that is that's typical of how a DLC or a download or imaging through the DLC would look, with or without the keys, depending on the vehicle. That's what it would look like. Now, I tell people all the time, do we have the vehicle? I know it's been a year since the accident. It's long since been auctioned off if the insurance company didn't have a hold on the vehicle. This was a case I did not too many months ago. The vehicle this is about 2 years after the accident. The vehicle was long since auctioned off, long since sitting in a scrapyard, long since being picked apart for, odds and ends that survived the accident. I get there to look at it and I'm thinking to myself, well, this is not too bad. If nobody took the airbag module out of it for I don't know what they would do that for. It's already been used once and it shouldn't be able to be used in another vehicle, this particular vehicle anyway. So it doesn't look too bad. So I said, at least we might get data from this one. And sure enough, I lucked out, and all the wiring to the data link connector was intact. And I just had to power up the fuse block out under the hood. And even without the keys, this one gave me good information, even though it was a couple years after the fact. Okay, now we go to again another download. This one, even though it looks like it's a dashboard type of deal to the DLC, it's not. This one was actually a Ford restraint control module. And it's kind of obscured by the steering wheel, but you can see the airbag actually deployed in this vehicle from the steering wheel. This is, you'll see in the next slide, I think, I was actually plugged into the module itself. No, there's the module. That's where it's located. That's at the bottom of the dashboard. You can see the vinyl floor mat there. The module's kind of underneath the floor mat there. The gas pedal would be off to the left of that picture. So it's kind of buried underneath the bottom of the dashboard near where an ashtray would be in this car, I think it was. And again, the connector for that is on the left side of the module. You would undo or remove that connector and sneak in the cable from your CDR unit, and you could download directly from that restraint control module in that case. That same vehicle, in addition to the restraint control module inside, it has the PCM outside under the hood, which is a power control module, and that has a bunch of additional data in addition to the crash data stored in the RCM inside. Here's the connection. You see the black cable and that squarish looking plug. That's my CDR system plugged into the PCM. And at the other end of that cable, it's plugged into the blue box, which is the Bosch unit. The gray cable extending away from that and goes to my laptop. Okay, I think this brings us to the first break. If anybody has questions, hopefully I'll have answers. Matt, I think, is fielding questions, but I don't see anything yet.
Right. Yes, George. If for the attendees out there who have questions, please use the chat feature of the Q&A found on the right-hand side of the screen, and we'll get your questions to George as quickly as they come in. George, we have had a couple questions that have come in, and we have one from Phil who asks, what's the best way to get training on this function? I guess he's referring to the PCM function. Okay.
The best way to get training, it's only available through, well, the official Bosch approved training, I should say, is only available through several sources right now. If you go on the Bosch website, they will tell you who is offering that training right now. One is IPTM down in, I think it's Jacksonville, Florida. It's the Institute for Police Training and Management, something like that. They offer training. Collision Safety Institute, I think, in San Diego, they offer training. And there's another recent addition to the group. I don't remember the name of them offhand. It's like CDRtraining.com or something along those lines. They also offer training. It's open to pretty much anyone that wants to pay for it. There is different types of training. There's like a one-day session that will teach you essentially how to use the equipment, how to do an imaging safely without ruining any data, things along those lines, but not so much anything to do with analyzing the data. There's a 4 or 5 day class that talks about once you've got the data, how to analyze the data and decide what the data means, and then there's also additional classes on how to integrate that data with accident reconstruction. There is also, maybe on a more local level, you might be able to find someone in law enforcement who's gone through the train the trainer program, and they're teaching, locally, or maybe at a local sheriff's office or something like that, a course in how to, it's called the technician's course, how to access the data. All right, Matt, is there another one?
Yeah, we have a couple actually in the queue here. Stephen asks, how much time does someone need to access the data and create a reconstruction if the vehicle is intact?
Okay. To access the data depends on how ragged the car is. I mean, there's certainly been cases where I've gone to download vehicles from a low impact where essentially there's no damage to the vehicle or the damage has been repaired, and that can literally be done in 5 minutes. Sometimes it almost takes longer to boot the laptop up than it does to actually get the data. Some vehicles, you may have to sit on the module for 8 minutes before it goes through all 3 rounds of collecting the data. Other ones, depending on what you're faced with and how much aggravation and work it is to get the diagnostic link connector to work or to power up the vehicle, or if once the vehicle's crashed, there's no telling what you're going to run into to actually access the module. It could take an hour, hour and a half sometimes just to get the vehicle to cooperate, let's say. And as far as the accident reconstruction, that entirely depends on how much other information you have to work with. I mean, certainly you'd have a scene or a site investigation. You'd have 1 or 2 or maybe 3 vehicle investigations, and then depending on what kind of evidence you have to work with, certainly several hours worth of analysis tacked on to that to do the accident reconstruction.
Great, George. We've got one more, and then we'll continue on with the presentation of content. And we will get to everyone's questions. We've had a slew of questions submitted here, but we need to take one more, and then we'll go on with the presentation of content, and we'll answer them during the second Q&A break. George, how can you tell that downloaded crash data was created by an accident, i.e. ensure that no non-deployment events were inadvertently created and documented by the mechanism or by the recorder.
Okay, typically with a non-deployment event, you'll get some indication of mile per hour and engine RPM, throttle position, enough additional information to tell you that it's a valid non-deployment event. If you try and tie in a non-deployment event to a particular crash, because non-deployment events, there's no timestamp on any of these. It's possible to have a non-deployment event from 3 months before this particular accident and have nothing to do with the particular accident you're investigating. You have to look at one of the things it keeps track of is ignition cycles. So you have ignition cycles from the day the car was born. It keeps track of that up until ignition cycles at the time of investigation. So you have to compare and see if you can keep track of if we have 3,333 ignition cycles at the event and 3,335, just 2 more at the time of the investigation. That's a pretty good indication that your non-deployment event is tied to what you're actually investigating. All righty?
Hey, why don't we continue on with the presentation of content, and we'll get to the rest of the questions during the second Q&A break. Go ahead, George.
All right. Okay, now we're going to talk about once you've got the equipment and you can plug in and you can start to get data, what would we expect to see? And the events that it'll pick up are divided into 2 categories. We have deployment level events and non-deployment level events, and then you can probably guess what the difference is there. Deployment level events include the activation of any pyrotechnic device in the vehicle, basically, and it could be the belt pretensioners and not just the airbags. So don't get thrown. I've seen many times where people say the airbags didn't go off, we got rid of the car. It's not just the airbag, and if it's not a severe impact, or sometimes depending on whether or not the occupants were buckled, it might the ACM or RCM might fire only the seatbelt pretensioners, and it's not always obvious until somebody actually goes and looks at the car and checks those things to see if we have a deployment level event. Deployment level events are generally locked. The only time that they're not that I can think of would be, again, with the Ford PCM, where data can continue to get overwritten if something goes wrong during the crash event. Non-deployment events can absolutely be overwritten by another, later non-deployment or a bigger and better non-deployment or a deployment. And just as a frame of reference, the modules in cars even today, they typically have less memory than the average calculator did back in 1970, whatever. These things are really, really skimpy on memory. So there's not a lot of room to write a lot of different things. It's certainly not like a computer or a laptop. It's like the smallest of small chips you can imagine that they use to actually store the data. All right, so now the capabilities, again, what kind of data might we expect to get from the different events? Certainly crash data at AE, which is algorithm enable, and after AE. So this is, now we're talking, the crash data is after we've had an impact. That data is typically all gathered in a matter of milliseconds. I'm trying to think what the longest, 300 milliseconds comes to mind for maybe the longest run of after algorithm enable. 300 milliseconds is 0.3 of a second, so most of the crash is done and over with just that quickly. So crash data, certainly half a second after algorithm enable or AE is what you're looking at in that period. Pre-crash data is what's leading up to the impact or what's leading up to AE, and that could be anywhere from a few seconds to some of the Fords will give you a couple of minutes apparently the PCMs have much more memory to write things into than the airbag modules or restraint control modules. So certain Fords will give you several minutes of what this car was doing, speed-wise, brakes, what gear he was in, the whole 9 yards, before we actually have the crash. Certainly vehicle speed is one of the big things that people like to look at. Throttle position, what the driver was doing with the gas pedal, whether or not they were on the brake pedal or off the brake pedal is another one that's typical. Engine speed, engine RPM, can give you an idea of what gear they were in between that and throttle position. It tells you if they were really, crank on this thing to take off or completely off, idling along with the brake on. You can judge those kinds of things. Again, delta V is a common, parameter that's displayed or gathered in a CDR imaging. And again, seatbelt status, with a few exceptions, I think you almost always get driver's belt status, which is about everything I've ever seen. And again, as time goes on, the data that's available gets, to me, better and better and better with the newer vehicles. They give you so much data, it's almost amazing anymore. That it's hard not to view this as a standalone thing, which you shouldn't do, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But you do get a lot of data, everything from steering wheel input to whether or not the cruise control was active. A lot of good information. Okay, now report formats. Once you've got the data and you've downloaded it or imaged the module, you've got the data in your laptop or on your desktop. What do you do with it? And the Bosch CDR system, that will save it in a .cdr file, which, unless you have the Bosch program, it's pretty much useless unless you want to just email it to someone else that has the Bosch program. You need the Bosch program or the Bosch software to actually open a .cdr file. But the good news is we're told that CDR files cannot be manipulated or doctored in any way, shape, or form, unlike PDF files or text files or comma-separated value files. The CDR file is almost guaranteed to be the real deal. Next, the CDR program can also print out a PDF file. It's essentially the same viewing that you would see in a CDR version of the report, except it's done in Adobe PDF for people that don't have the CDR program to open it. And last but not least, I think the CSV files, the Bosch program can export all of its data in a CSV file that you can dump into an Excel spreadsheet or whichever program you like to analyze the data. And I'll show you one example of that in the next, toward the end of the presentation. I have a slide to show you what you can do with that data. And again, always try to get the CDR file. That is essentially considered the holy grail because other things can be doctored. And again, CDR files, you should always use the latest version of the program because that has the most recent translation software in it. Anything they may have picked up as glitches, things that didn't translate properly from earlier versions, hopefully they have corrected in the latest versions. So whenever possible, latch onto the latest version of the program to look at things. File sizes, they are really minuscule. I mean, I looked at some that are under 1 kilobyte. Now, I'm thinking a 2-page Microsoft Word document. Those are 33 kilobytes, maybe 100 kilobytes, something like that. These are smaller than that. It's like absolutely nothing to email the CDR files or a PDF file easily, very easily emailed. Okay, now integration with accident reconstruction. The EDR data, or the data you would get from a CDR imaging of a module, it's always taught in any class you take that that's essentially just another tool in the accident reconstructionist toolbox. It's always tempting to plug into a car and get the data and say, wow, they were going 85 miles an hour, or wow, they're going 87 miles an hour. And that's a dangerous thing to do because you need to do, if not a full-blown accident reconstruction, enough of an accident reconstruction to go along with that to satisfy the does it make sense requirement, basically. Don't forget the data that's in the car. It's only the result of what the car thinks is going on. If you have the wheels spinning, I mean, the car could be on ice, and the car could actually be traveling at 7 miles an hour, and the speedometer can indicate 100 miles an hour. So these things have to be considered. So that the data by itself is not, you know, the be-all, end-all to accident reconstruction, and it doesn't put accident reconstructionists out of business like many feared it would at the onset of this technology. Again, you know, the data should be considered in conjunction with a complete accident reconstruction. That's again, one of the course, the foundations of teaching the CDR technology. They say this is not standalone stuff. And most recently, in the last year or two, I want to say there's been a trend toward let's look at the EDR data and see what we can do with it in accident reconstruction. Maybe because more and more vehicles are having the data available, or less and less times we're getting roadway evidence to kind of help us with what the vehicles were doing. But if you have at least one vehicle in a crash and that has EDR data, by all means, you know, get the data from that vehicle, because you can use that with a conservation of momentum analysis to ascertain, you know, what the other vehicle was doing that was involved in the crash. So you'll more than likely be able to get the weights of both vehicles with the speed of one vehicle, or the delta V from one vehicle, and the weights of both vehicles. You can do a lot of accident reconstruction just from those very, very, very basic things. All right, now, federal regulations. Back in 2006 or thereabouts, the federal government said, okay, it looks like this EDR stuff is going to be something we should watch over and maybe regulate, for lack of a better term. So they came up with 49 CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 563, and that covers these areas. And basically, I'm thrilled to see this because for many years I was an automotive technician, and nothing aggravated me more than having every manufacturer out there have different software, different hardware, different acronyms for everything under the sun, different parameters. There was no commonality between, you know, one manufacturer's line and another's with diagnostic equipment. And I'd feared that the EDR technology was going to go down that same road, but the federal government stepped in and said, basically, let's see, the next couple of slides, I think it'll show you. Here's what they said. This part specifies uniform, which is good, national requirements for vehicles equipped with event data recorders. Now, you can read the rest and see that it concerns pretty much, you know, everything involved. But the kicker is, it's for vehicles equipped with event data recorders, and you'll see in the next slide or two. Okay, there's the purpose is to be able to access the data and present it for crash investigation and so on and so forth. But here's the real kicker. It applies to vehicles. Originally it was September 1, 2010. It's now been bumped out to September 1, 2012, which is sort of kind of telling me it's going to be the 2013 model year vehicles. And it's if they're equipped with an event data recorder. So I wouldn't be surprised if you're going to see some vehicles still not having an event data recorder, so they won't have to comply with what the federal government wants them to keep track of or to record and how long they want to record it and so on and so forth. So they're just going to flat out not have EDRs at all. But those that do, they're going to be tied into what the federal regulations say they're going to have to keep track of. Now, because we're winding up close to the end here, I wanted to kind of run through just one video of a crash test. It's not very often we actually get a video of a real live crash, and although I have plenty from crash conferences, and those are well documented in CDR reports, this one I had handy, so I grabbed this, and I wanted to just go through it maybe once or twice and highlight a couple things for you to see. If I can get the video to work here.
It may not work. We're going to have to. We can send out the link to the video because we would have to do a special embed on the PowerPoint. Sorry, George.
That's okay. All right.
So we'll send it out. We'll send it out though after the webinar is over.
All right. Well, then I'll clue everybody in what to watch for. In this particular crash, the vehicle in the top left corner of the video screen, you see a minus 20 ms, so that's minus 20 milliseconds, and that's a little counter. The video will be in slow motion. That's a little clock that tells you where in the crash we are, and this one runs out to I think 399 milliseconds, which is almost 0.4 of a second. So even though it's in slow motion, it looks like it takes 30 seconds for it to happen or whatever. This all happened in less than half a second. So as the Saturn approaches the impact barrier, it looks like it's barely touching the barrier. You'll see a flash on the left-hand side of the screen, and no doubt that's one of the NHTSA or their testing agency's cameras taking a picture right at the onset of the impact event. You'll see that flash when you play the video. The next thing I want you to take note of is watch that little clock. You'll have to watch the video several times. I know I had to watch it a bunch of times to get this type of information. When you watch the video, you'll see the clock, certainly by 30 milliseconds, the airbag from the steering wheel is already out of the steering wheel. At 30 milliseconds in, now consider that the blink of an eye is like literally a tenth of a second or thereabouts, and one eye blink is a tenth of a second. So here we have, in 1/3 of the time it takes for an eye blink, that airbag control module has already made the decision to deploy the airbag, and it's out of the steering wheel at 30 milliseconds into the life. And look at the damage to the vehicle, or I should say, what struck me more is the lack of damage to the vehicle at 30 milliseconds. That the module has already made that decision when there's barely any damage done to the front end of the vehicle. It's already decided, this is kind of what's coming. I better set the airbags off. So that's, let's see, watch for the flash, watch for the minimal damage when the airbag actually goes off. This particular dummy is unrestrained, so you can watch his kinematics as he plants himself toward the steering wheel and up into the windshield. So you can see how an unrestrained occupant reacts to the barrier crash. And the last thing that you'll want to look at in the video, the vehicle impacts the barrier at a speed of 24, 25 mile an hour, which we'll see in the next slide. And after it's done impacting the barrier, it bounces back away from the barrier, and then that's going to be significant. And we'll see in the next slide why that's going to look significant. Here's the corresponding CDR, crash data retrieval system report, that went along with that video that I can't show you. And it's at the top of the file information area. It shows the vehicle identification number. That's something that the investigator would have entered manually, in the program, in this particular case. Further down, the last in that particular table, it shows event or events recovered, and it's one deployment and one non-deployment in this case. And let's go to the next bit of information in the CD report. System status at deployment. The SIR warning lamp status. SIR is supplemental inflatable restraint system. Essentially, that's your airbag light on your dashboard, is all it is. And so that was off at the time of the impact, which is a good thing because that means there was no diagnostic trouble codes, before the impact. The driver's belt switch circuit status shows unbuckled, which we would expect because when you see in the video, they really launch into the windshield. Ignition cycles at deployment, 66, which is telling me this is essentially a brand new vehicle. I mean, that's very, very, very low to get that many, on and off cycles of the key, basically. Ignition cycles at investigations, only 3 cycles later, 3 cycles after they whacked the thing into the wall. They must have moved it around a little bit, and we have 69 ignition cycles in investigation. The maximum SDM is Sensing and Diagnostic Module Algorithm Forward Velocity Change. So that's our delta V. Maximum delta V in this case was minus 26.22 mile an hour. Now, if we look at the chart below, you see seconds before AE in the left column. Then we have vehicle speed in the next to the left column. It's 24, 25 mile per hour. But our delta V is higher than 25 miles per hour. And that's that rebound off the wall that I was telling you about. Coming into the wall, it's going 25 miles per hour, let's say. From 25 down to 0, that would be a delta V of 25. And then it actually goes backwards at, let's say, 1.22 miles per hour. So it gives us a delta V that's actually higher than the vehicle's speed, which is perfectly normal, and that's not unusual to see that at all. Next couple lines down, driver's first stage, driver's second stage. You can see at 15 milliseconds into the event, the airbag module had already made the decision to fire the airbag. And the last thing in the top chart there, event recording complete. We have a yes, which is a good sign. That means we captured all the data there is to capture. In the older versions of the program, because this testing was done back in 05 or 06, I think, they used to provide a graph of the basic parameters, the pre-crash information leading up to the accident. We have vehicle speed, and that's the reddish-orangish line almost straight across at 24, 25 mile an hour. That's like a straight run in. Engine speed, percent throttle, and brake status, those are all overlapped at the bottom of that graph because they were all 0. The engine wasn't running, so we have engine speed would be 0. The dummy was not stepping on the throttle, so we have 0% throttle, and the dummy was not stepping on the brake, so we have zeros. We have straight zeros for those three items. The crash pulse. Now, this is the crash signature or crash pulse that the module actually records. And it's that graph. It starts all up in the left-hand corner there near 0. The first 10 milliseconds we don't see, so there's a little bit of a drop in the first 10 milliseconds. Time in milliseconds runs across the bottom of the graph. We can see it drop from 0 down to 26, just below 25, so that corresponds to the table we had looked at before. Across the bottom of this graph, we see 10 on the left and 150 on the right. So that tells me this particular module was capable of reading out to 150 milliseconds, but it shut off at essentially 110 milliseconds. It doesn't give us any data past 110 milliseconds, and that's because you can see the slope of that graph leveled off at 100 milliseconds to 110. There was no more change in velocity. It kind of leveled off at 25, 26 miles an hour. So the module says, you know what? I'm done here. There's nothing else exciting going on. I'm not even going to bother recording any further information. So the module just kind of discards everything beyond that point, which is also normal. Now, this is the last slide, I believe, and I wanted to show you one example of the kind of information you can get out of a late model vehicle. This was a 2010 Jeep Wrangler. And there was a question as to what happened prior to this guy. I think he hit a tree and rolled it over. And there was a question as to whether or not he had fallen asleep or whether he had just driven into the tree or so on and so forth. This is the blue in this one is the rotational input of the steering wheel itself. And the orangish, brownish square dots, that's the yaw rate, which is the vehicle itself moving, turning left or right. So you can see by this, we start off on the graph, and look at the bottom line there going across. There's a -5, a -4.9, 4.8. It reads across the bottom of the graph all the way down to -0.1 on the right-hand side. That is 5 seconds before impact, or 5 seconds before algorithm enabled. 0 would be on the right-hand side. We had a 0. That would be algorithm enabled, which is like the impact event. So here we have 5 seconds before impact. We got a little twitch of the steering wheel. And then around 2 seconds before, we have another twitch of the steering wheel. And then around 6 or 7/10 of a second before the actual impact, we have not a twitch, but it's a big yank on the steering wheel. It's up over 80 degrees. It's like 85 degrees. That's almost a quarter of a turn of steering wheel input, trying to get this vehicle to avoid smacking into whatever they ran into, and we have a corresponding change in the vehicle direction, represented by those little, square blocks on the orangish, brownish line, tracking the steering wheel input eventually. All right, so that pretty much winds up my presentation for now, except for we'll hit as many questions and then answers as Matt will allow me. So Matt, I'll kick it back to you for some questions.
Okay, excellent, and thank you so much for the great presentation. We have a question here from Titus who asks, how long is the data stored, and can it be pulled if the vehicle is still being driven? Is it kept by date and time, for example? How is it segmented?
All right, the data, depending on if you had a deployment or a non-deployment event, if it's a deployment event and it got written into memory, and if it was a Ford, if you received the restraint deployment signal, that is essentially stored forever. On the older vehicles, they used to, it would go to a body shop, it would get repaired if it wasn't like totaled. They would replace the airbag modules because they were like a one write and they're done. So that information would stay in there forever. The later model, later model Chryslers, I think they can write up to 5 separate accidents in one module. So I guess they're getting smarter and memory's getting cheaper. Then you don't have to spend $3, $4, $5, $1,000, whatever it is, to replace the module every time somebody has an airbag deployment. So that's the later technology. There's no time or date stamp for passenger cars, light trucks, medium trucks that the Bosch CDR stuff can work with. There's no time stamp, there's no date stamp associated with the data. Some of the heavy trucks, they do have time and date stamps, but you have to be very careful because some of them are not 100% as accurate as you'd like them to be. But for the most part, the stuff that I see, that the light trucks and passenger cars, there's no time or date stamp. The information, if it's locked in there, it's in there forever. Again, if it's a non-deployment, it could be overwritten 5 minutes after the accident. If a tow truck driver comes up and has the ignition key on and he bumps this thing, hard onto the back of his tow truck, he could overwrite a non-deployment and with a new non-deployment, essentially. So, Titus, I hope that answered your question. All right, next one, Pat.
Okay, we have a question here from Stuart who asks, will the CDR provide information if a car going 65 miles an hour allegedly impacts a car going 50 miles an hour and then slows down so that the cars only collided for a brief second? Will they give that? Will the CDR allow you to discern that level of detail?
Depending on the year, make, and model, and how hard of a bump it was. I mean, if they're going 65 and they whack into the back of somebody going 50, that's a pretty good bump. And conceivably, that's a 15-mile-per-hour Delta V. That's usually enough to get the airbags to deploy. It's like right on the edge, but you might have a deployment. So I guess in your case, you're talking about since they continued on, let's say the airbags did not go off, so we'd have a non-deployment. If nobody had a more significant non-deployment after that event, we would expect to have data stored related to that event. But the problem you run into is because there's no date and time stamp, we can't tell if it's from that event or if it's from something else. There's certainly nothing that says, vehicle A banged into vehicle B, nothing that detailed. And you won't have any information after. Like it might show the initial 65 mile an hour, it might show the Delta V down to 50 miles an hour, and data associated with that. But after that, you're not going to have any data showing him having slowed down to zero and coming to a stop or something like that. Unless it's a Ford PCM and you had several minutes of data, you might catch it in that case. But that would be a very, very rare thing, I would think. All right, next one.
Okay, excellent. We have 3 more questions that we'll get to, and then we'll finish it up. George, can you determine the current status of all attached components, including the acceleration status?
All right, can you determine, let me see if I can,
Yeah, I can send you that question.
send me that one so I can see it.
I don't think you can. Hold on for 1 second. Here, I'm sending it to you right now. There you go. You should see it on the screen now.
All right, can you determine the current status of all attached components, including accelerometers? Not with the CDR equipment. All attached components, if you're referring to everything from the throttle position switch to transmission range selectors to deployment loops, each airbag has its own deployment loop, and even though the airbag module monitors those things, that's not the kind of stuff that the CDR equipment will access. You'd need something like the dealer's diagnostic tool that the shop technicians would use. That in conjunction with the CDR equipment, you would certainly be able to access anything and everything that's on the network, and everything's plugged into the network nowadays. In the vehicle's controller area network. So you can, once you access the DLC, you can pretty much find out anything that's plugged into it, as long as the wiring has survived the accident. I'm going to say. I imagine we're talking post-accident, so that's going to be a key thing is to make sure that the wiring itself survives post-accident. All right, next one.
Okay, we have two more questions, and then we'll wrap up the presentation. Is the Toyota system for data the same as Bosch, as the Bosch system, and are there other data download devices and systems?
Okay, the Toyota, for a couple years now, Toyota has had their own thing. Every one I've ever seen from Toyota themselves has been called a preliminary tool, or it's not their final version of the tool. And the downloads I've seen from the Toyota equipment varies a little bit from the Bosch downloads of what's available. For instance, if you did a download of a Toyota with both, back to back, you did it with the Toyota equipment and you did it with the Bosch equipment, you'd get the same information. Basically, the reports would look a little bit different, but other than that, it should be the same data. And again, Toyota, they can do, there's still some years, makes, and models that are proprietary. They haven't released that information yet, or licensed that information to Bosch, and they may never, because it seems to be more of a forward-going technology than rearward. We're not so much concerned with, going back and being able to do it for 2002 and 2003 vehicles. They're much more consumed with staying up with the vehicles that are coming down the pike, so to speak. So I think that answered the question about everything with Toyota, I think.
Okay, no, thank you. And we have one final question. Can you get the algorithm for each module with the Bosch equipment or any other equipment that downloads all the information?
Okay, of all the things that you can get, the algorithm itself is probably the most proprietary information, and I don't think anybody in court or out of court has ever actually gotten the algorithm itself that tells you what's going to make this module make the decision to deploy or not deploy something. I've never seen, I've seen plenty of confidential documentation, for airbag cases from different manufacturers, and I've seen them skirt around, the parameters that go into determining what the algorithm is, but the actual algorithm, I think it's a finely tuned and evolving thing that's particular to a specific, year, make, and model, and many times, subtypes within that model. They'll tune the algorithm to that specific vehicle. So I don't think anybody has access to the algorithm itself. And again, the algorithm being that, if you want to call it, for lack of a better term, formula that determines what combination of impact speed and crash duration is going to warrant, the airbag to deploy or not to deploy, as the case may be. Alrighty.
Okay, excellent, George. Well, I think that wraps up the Q&A session, and on behalf of all the attendees and all of us here at TASA, thank you so much for the time and effort that you put into the presentation. I thought it was great, so thank you.
I thank everybody for taking time out of their day to listen to me.
Yeah, no, definitely. If you'd like to speak to George about a case or a matter that you're working on, please contact us here at TASA. Our number is 800-523-2319. We'll be sending out a link to the archived recording of this webinar tomorrow morning, and we'll include in that a link to the copy of the PowerPoint as well. The archived recording of this webinar and every webinar can be found in the TASA Knowledge Center. If you go to the TASA website, tasanet.com, and click on Knowledge Center in the top-level navigation, you'll be able to find the link to all the webinars. Our next client-focused webinar will be the proper environmental management of industrial equipment, and that will take place next Tuesday, October 18th. And if you have any follow-up questions or comments, please send them to me via email. My email address is mhyde@tasanet.com. We do take all of the comments, and we use them to make our presentations and programs better. So we do welcome all of your comments. And on behalf of George and everybody here at TASA, I thank you for your time, and we look forward to seeing you at future TASA programs. Thank you so much.
Thank you.